In the last episode, you heard Peter Sestoff and Mess Nielsen talk about the late nights and coming up with the beginnings of the center. And now let's talk to Professor Serge Belongie about moving across the oceans with his family, leaving New York and coming to Copenhagen to build the Pioneer Center and his ambitions for the future. And yeah, let's see. He has a few good things to share. Hi, Serge.
Hey, Geet.
Thanks for making the time.
Absolutely.
In your busy schedule. Let's go back a little bit, because it's been an exciting few years for you, right? You sort of moved to a new country, set up a new center. Take me back a few years. Where did all this start? Sort of the idea for the Pioneer Center and your interest in kind of moving to Denmark?
Sure. Yeah, so this goes way back in history before the pandemic, and that's important in terms of understanding this trajectory. So for context, my wife is Danish, and we actually got married in Denmark. And we had been making trips to Denmark over the last decade or so, once or twice a year. And I had known various Danish researchers at different universities. I had participated in thesis defenses and so on. So I knew there was a very strong academic community here, but it had really not crossed my mind to make a move to Europe. I was at Cornell at the time. I was quite happy there. But that really changed during the pandemic. And at the time we had two small kids at home. Our kids now are 6 and 8. And the way that the pandemic hit the New York City area was it had a significant, it changed the way that we looked at work and life, and we really had a broader view about what we might want to do in terms of work-life balance. And I had already been in touch with, as I mentioned, a number of professors, mostly at University of Copenhagen and DTU. And I started to hear from more than one of them that the Danish government was thinking about creating this Pioneer Center concept. And I think you've talked to some of the founding team, some of the academics that contributed to that initial proposal. And this was a very ambitious, audacious effort to bring together multiple foundations from big Danish companies to do something huge. The first of these Pioneer Centers, as you know, ended up being artificial intelligence, but the Pioneer Center concept was bigger than that. The second one involves sustainable agriculture. There's another one that involves novel materials for renewable energy. So I really liked the sound of this. I liked the idea that there could be this center that draws on talents across an entire country. So on that backdrop of kind of being open to new experiences and thinking about where we wanted to raise our kids, my wife and I started that discussion. We said, I think the phrasing was, would this be completely crazy to explore? I really liked my job at Cornell, and New York City is a place that even in the hardest of times, people line up around the world just to get a chance to be there. But we thought, why don't we give it a try? And the core writing team, as I mentioned, you've already interviewed Mass and Peter, and so this group of people who would come together to write the proposal for the Pioneer Center, I really got to know them well, and I just participated in writing that proposal without actually knowing whether I would come here, which was a little strange, but occurred to me that this was something that I wanted to exist, even if I didn't end up running it. So that was around summer 2020, and we were brainstorming all the time about the structure of this center. Who would be involved? How would you coordinate remote campuses? And I could draw on my experience doing something similar at Cornell, where the main campus was in upstate New York, about a 3.5-hour drive north from New York City, and Cornell Tech was in Manhattan. And there were faculty at both places, lots of challenges with communications and getting people all on the same page. And I realized that's kind of similar. And I thought, wow, this is actually a pretty amazing opportunity. And this seems naive in retrospect, but I was thinking that the AI hype was actually about to subside because the deep learning revolution really kicked off around 2012. And for that to last 8 solid years is pretty remarkable. And it's amazing in terms of being able to raise funds for grant proposals and so on, all the exciting startup companies, but it's also pretty overwhelming. And I thought maybe things are going to calm down and we can just focus on research and some other area will capture the media's attention, superconductors, crypto, something, and then we can just do our thing. And then of course, generative AI took off. So it was kind of a dream that came into being. And as I said, I didn't actually know if I would get the job. I just thought it would be fascinating to put something like this together. And the way that I thought about it, in principle, could work in Southern California, the Bay Area, the Boston area, New York City. Those are all places with a concentration of excellent academia. But this opportunity that emerged was in Scandinavia. And I thought, this is an amazing opportunity. I have to try this.
How did you envision the sort of, what was unique about this setup? And what is unique about it today?
Well, let's start with what's not unique, because every region of the world has some AI strategy. And they all talk about human-centric and society and so on. And it's understandable that the public is a little bit cynical about that. So yes, there are many elements of the center that are similar to what you'd see in California, in the UK. I get that. But there is a foundational difference, which is that in Scandinavia and in Denmark in particular, there is a relatively high level of trust in institutions. There's a high level of digitalization of public services. None of this is perfect, but I'm talking about relatively high levels of trust. And that actually creates a meaningful backdrop for studying things like AI with positive societal impact, the socio-technical landscape, participatory design. There are actually traditions in Denmark and Sweden going back decades that form a foundation for that. And that's one of the substantial differences in the center. I think it gives us, it puts some weight behind some of those strategies.
Could you give an example?
Well, historically with participatory design, it sounds a little bit Stone Age now, but if you think back to when databases were popular, this is even before spreadsheets, just databases. That was something that could revolutionize small businesses, small to medium businesses. And in Denmark, the participatory design researchers, for example, from Aarhus University, brought together auto union workers and database developers to come up with systems that were mutually beneficial. Those are very different communities. It wasn't done in an adversarial way. It wasn't tech solutionism. And when you look at how digitalized Denmark is, and in fact, a lot of Scandinavia, there are stories like that that are not glamorous or sensational. It just has to do with reaching consensus and getting people at the table and talking about how, as I mentioned, the socio-technical landscape will look. It's not about throwing technology over the transom and saying, now what's going to happen? And you see that same kind of thing. It's I would say, a constructive tension between Silicon Valley and Europe. And I'm aware that that is something that needs to be addressed as we develop an AI center. But I think that there is really something special there in terms of the way society works with technology in Denmark. They're not in a hurry to adopt it. And they obviously see the potential. But when they look on social media at some of the dumpster fires that are taking shape, particularly coming out of California, there's reason to be concerned. So I think there's a lot of opportunity there to do some interesting work. Yeah, this brings us to the distinction between the moonshots or the grand challenges and the day-to-day work that any given PhD student works on. So we are in the process of curating a set of moonshots, and those, some of which have already taken shape, those transmit the vision of the center. So you can get to know the center's personality through the moonshots. But moonshots, if you think about the lifetime of a Pioneer Center, it's 10 to 13 years. It really lets you think about the big picture. A PhD student is usually here for 3 years. If you combine it with a master's, it could be 5 years, postdoc, probably 1 to 2 years. So the moonshots are really designed to be decade scale. And we encourage all of the faculty affiliated with the center to think about moonshots and to talk to their groups about it and to circulate these ideas. But we also know that when it comes to any given PhD student, they also want to graduate, they want to write papers, they want to get great jobs. And so we do have an element of pragmatism. So I take it with a grain of salt, or I'm able to laugh at it a little bit, because I will talk about these moonshots with my group and they're always nodding along. Yeah, that's cool. Definitely. We want to do that. We want to change the world. But then they go back to their desks and they're fine tuning LLMs. I totally get it. I don't blame them. And I think I was the same as a grad student. But it's still this idea of having these moonshots and transmitting the vision to the students. It does bend the arc of the AI research. But we also understand sometimes the students kind of chuckle at us, say, oh, there goes Serge or Mass again talking about changing the world. I get it. But every once in a while, one of those students says, oh, that's interesting. They see something, they have a eureka moment and come back and say, is that what you're talking about? I see what you mean. Something involving misinformation detection on the web or something. And they realize, yeah, we couldn't do that in Silicon Valley. Google wouldn't be able to roll out this product. Facebook would want such a service, but they don't have that kind of trust with the public. Now it's starting to make sense. The same kind of thing could happen in a medical context for fair medicine, unbiased medical diagnoses. The way that the medical records are linked within Denmark, that's a kind of unprecedented access that researchers can have. So these things don't occur to students overnight. There's something that kind of has to be soaked up and absorbed. And I really do believe it has to be balanced with pragmatism. And I'm completely fine if some of the students that come out are just solid AI researcher engineers. There's nothing wrong with that. But we do, especially those of us who picked up our families and moved across an ocean to be here, you have to ask, why do it?
Yeah.
What, especially with all the lucrative positions that are out there in industry, why do it? It's got to be something crazy.
So what is a moonshot?
Yeah. So I can give you some examples, but the original moonshot template, if you look at the way that P1 is structured, we use some motivating examples to talk about moonshots. And so the one I use for illustration is Visipedia. And Visipedia is best known in its in a couple instantiations, like the iNaturalist app or the Merlin Bird ID app. So these are apps for people who like to go out in nature, go bird watching, look at mushrooms, take pictures of plants. And those apps, one came out of the California Academy of Sciences, one came out of the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. The apps existed for, in some cases, a decade before, but without any sort of AI functionality built in. And the Visipedia team, a group of researchers from Caltech, UC San Diego, Cornell, now University of Copenhagen, we all thought that's a huge opportunity to get people and machines working together in a kind of social network that has this distributed intelligence to recognize species, to understand behavior of animals, to diagnose disease and so forth. And so the kind of moonshot in that context is something like, what if you could recognize every living thing on the planet from visual, auditory, genetic, any kind of multimodal data? What if that were possible? Really, the moonshot is do it so that anyone that has this mobile device in their hand can point it at absolutely anything and get Wikipedia-like information through visual channels. And it turns out we've actually made huge progress along those lines. And it isn't Visipedia, the research project, that is out there front and center. That's actually not the style of our center. It's behind the scenes. If you go to those apps and you look at the about pages, there you see it. You see Visipedia, you see the university names. We're not looking to make the apps that are right there in the end user's hands. We're helping these human communities of knowledge bring AI into the system and make these transformative experiences.
Because you don't have to create these moonshots.
Yeah.
So like, why do it? What is the purpose behind having these big ambitions that are front and center of the center?
So first, in terms of this critical role of scientific communication and dissemination, just some comments on that.
Yeah.
That is very much one of the functions of P1. And we're part of this landscape of AI and data science and digitalization. There are several centers that work together and see it as our shared goal to communicate about science to government representatives, nonprofits, and so on, investment groups, so that they understand how to separate the hype from the reality.
No.
And we have, as part of the PhD program, students are actually going out there and meeting small and medium-sized companies and giving talks and demystifying ChatGPT. I give talks on a regular basis that have that same theme. And it's very often to audiences that are scared and worried. And they've read articles that part of them thinks they're crazy nonsense, but they're just not sure. And so it is actually a very valuable component of what P1 is doing, that we can address that need.
Where do you see sort of the biggest things that, I don't want to say annoy you, but that you see in the media that like they're just totally getting this wrong, and this is just running away with it? Where like, you know, some commentary or some feedback from someone with some understanding of the space would actually help.
Yeah, I could pick on specifics, but really it's same shit, different DJ.
Yeah.
If you just look at, you go back to the printing press, the telegraph, internet search engines, the transition from Yahoo to Google, any of these, the spreadsheet, relatively low cost satellites, every single time one of these technologies comes out, there's a certain cast of characters that emerges. And it so happens now we have social media, so you get the whole peanut gallery that lines up, and they're amplified a lot more than in the past. But if you go back to the New York Times and you look at when transatlantic telegraph cables were put down, or you look at some of the breathless articles about the effects that spreadsheets would have to democratize accounting, and that you didn't need these annoying programmers anymore. There's a similar kind of no-code thread that's running through that, and the ability of unlocking that technology from those programmers that were sort of gatekeeping. When it came to Google becoming widespread, it's hard to imagine that today, but prior to Google, Yahoo was dominant, and it was sort of a yellow pages kind of structure. You kind of had to look into categories and find things.
I think Jan LeCun was on a Monk debate a few months ago. I forget who else was there, but it was a very great conversation, sort of on both sides of the AI pro and con side.
Yeah.
And I think anyone who watched that, and watched it a couple of times, if you didn't get it the first time over, was like, okay, there's great conversation. There's respect on both sides. Everyone has been to a great university and has a great career, and they can voice things in different ways. And you can make a decision as an adult, like, okay, which side do I agree with? And maybe there's a bit of a gray area where I'm sitting, right?
Yes.
And I think potentially some of the sort of foundational research that'll happen here will trickle out to those kind of conversations, right?
Yeah.
And I guess with that in mind, I want to sort of discuss the sort of 7-step plan.
So I mentioned earlier that our P1 affiliated PhD students are also kind of ambassadors for the center. And so traditionally, PhD students need to do a project proposal, get a co-advisor or a thesis committee and all that. Of course, all our students need to do that. But in addition, we give them a template for what you just described, the 7-step plan. And it isn't meant to be a burden. It really isn't even graded technically. It's something that these pioneering first students are actually helping us devise. But the idea of the 7-step plan is that they get this kind of blank document at the beginning of their PhD studies and a few points of inspiration to help them flesh it out. But it gives them a parallel roadmap to their publication-oriented PhD thesis trajectory. It's something where they can look at how they could have global impact in the work they're doing. And it's inspired by innovation, thinking, and entrepreneurship. You see these kinds of 6 or 7-step plans in startup incubators or accelerators. The difference there is that you're talking about maximizing value for shareholders. And the way that we adapted it was about maximizing positive societal impact. So some of the terms that you'll see borrowed from these startup incubators are inception, painstorming, deep dive, things like that. And what this is really about is trying to show the students that there is a journey and that they need to anticipate ups and downs. And we know that the advisor and the student can navigate the conventional conferences and journals. They know that type of thing. But this 7-step plan, it encourages the students to think really big. And so, and it starts with the moonshot. And maybe the first moonshot they come up with is silly, but they just sit down, maybe with other students, other people from Pioneer Center, and say, here's a moonshot, here's something crazy. Like, I want to build a cone of silence so I can sit at a cafe working on my laptop and just tune out all the sound. I just want an app where that person's chewing really loud and I just want to turn it down 10 dB, And if people look at them and say, that is not possible, that's when I'm getting interested. That's when I want to say, okay, that's an interesting moonshot. That's the inception of the idea. They weren't thinking globally right away. They're just thinking noise is a real big problem. And a lot of these big companies are pushing people into these open office plans, and people can't concentrate. And so there's a seed of an idea there. And then comes the painstorming. So you might start to look at this and say, well, if we want to roll it out, you need partners at Starbucks or Espresso House, or how do you do this? Are there privacy nightmares? What are the microphone arrays needed to do? I'm just making this up, but how do you actually do that? But because the students are told this part is going to hurt, they know to expect it. It's not that in P1 that we want to destroy their idea. We just really want to push back and say, defend it. This is impossible. Even if you could solve this, it would cost $1 million. You will never be able to do this. Now, in some cases, the students will say, yeah, you're right, and they'll just fill out the rest of their 7-step plan, with a little gesture here and there. And look, we're not going to crack down on it. We don't expect all the 7-step plans to be amazing. But when that spark forms, and that student, maybe they meet an acoustic engineer from DTU, and they tell them about this idea, and that student says, wow, I've been wanting to do that, but I don't have the AI chops to do the steerable beam arrays. Maybe we could do this, right? So once in a while, one of these is going to catch on. And we have this network of this, the National Advisory Board, which you're on, so we're very grateful for that. So our National Advisory Board consists of people that can provide really great feedback across many different areas. And we know that the students will be intimidated to talk to these people, but that advisory board is there to provide feedback and do some really cool stuff.
So you mentioned the 7 collaboratories.
Yeah.
And one stood out a little bit to me, XR. Can you just talk a bit about how that ended up in there?
Yeah. So I think the other collaboratories are probably less surprising. So things like speech and language, or causality and explainability, but you don't always see AR and VR in an AI lab. And I agree that's a little strange, but it was important to me to have that there. And in fact, the seeds of that were planted when I was still at Cornell. We created something called the XR Collaboratory as a standalone thing at Cornell, and it's still running. And the motivation there was this belief that I have that within 5 years or so, augmented reality will actually be the primary means through which most people will experience artificial intelligence in their lives.
How so? How do you see that coming about?
So there are a lot of devices out there that aren't actually called augmented reality, but are. For example, turn-by-turn directions in a car. We don't think of that as an AR system, but think about it. It is immersive. As you drive around, it's aware of where you are. It's got a display. It's multimodal. It's got a visual part. It has sensing. It's usually giving auditory directions. That's an augmented reality experience. Now, the average consumer doesn't think of it as that, but it's not important that a consumer call it the jargon that the engineers and scientists are using. What's important is getting the technology out there. So I think, well, we're well aware that many companies have tried and failed to make AR and VR devices. Magic Leap was a really big deal maybe 5 years ago. They didn't go out of business, but you don't hear about them anymore. Microsoft invested heavily in HoloLens, same kind of thing. It's still there, but it's just not.
It hasn't caught fire.
Yeah, and so, but most recently, Apple is launching a highly visible product, Vision Pro. And will it work? I don't know. But from an academic context, we have to ask ourselves, what's going to become possible when you have person-worn cameras, wearable cameras that are observing the environment around you, tracking your eyes, having this kind of spatial awareness when performing computation. And these things, there are some obvious benefits that you get in the context of assistive technology. So someone, for example, who's visually impaired that wants help shopping, someone who has memory impairments, and they need to get reminders with situational awareness around the home. And those of us that don't speak a certain language, when they go to a country and they see a menu and they can't read it, that's a form of a situational disability. You're not able to read that language, but it's increasingly the case that people will use their phone to snap a picture and show the translation. That's a form of augmented reality.
Yeah.
So it's still the case now that most augmented reality experiences involve handsets in some way. And the high profile products that are out there that involve immersion in some way are still often ridiculed by the public because it looks like you're strapping this big bulky phone to your face. And that's often the case with new technology. It looks chunky and weird. But from a PhD and postdoc project perspective, that's okay. I want students in our center to think about where this is going and how it can help emergency first responders, taxi drivers, all segments of society as this technology moves from being in your pocket or something that you're holding to being something that's in your glasses. But we want the students to think about how gestural interfaces will work. What's it going to be like to talk to these systems? And just a few years ago, things like chatbots were the butt of jokes, and people don't laugh at them anymore. No. So the ability to interact with these types of systems, for example, if you had a pair of smart glasses and you're riding a bike, you probably can't type on a smartphone. But the speech recognition technology and the chatbot infrastructure is pretty impressive.
What does success look like for you as its director, let's say in the halfway mark, in 6.5 years?
Yeah.
And at the 13-year mark?
Yeah, the nature of the success also can be looked at in terms of moonshots and that more pragmatic view. So first, from the pragmatic perspective, one of the really important goals for P1 is capacity building. We want to train master students, PhD students, postdocs. These are people who go on to become faculty, researchers at industry labs. They start innovative companies. They advise the government. So there's tremendous demand for AI skills. And so above all, we want to do capacity building. And the same is true with DDSA, the Danish Data Science Academy, DIREC more broadly in terms of digitalization. We're all working together for that. We can measure success in terms of the number of students that pass through the program, that successfully defend their thesis, who complete postdocs. We can look at things like job placement, companies that get started, that achieve seed funding or Series A. We can look at those types of indicators. And I would call those, to some sort of silly terminology, but that's like ordinary, extraordinary work, meaning they're doing extraordinary research, but it's also kind of what you would expect from a major AI research center. The part that will truly be extraordinary, which is still aspirational, is that we will actually achieve some of those moonshot goals. And there's a little twist to that, which is that a little bit like when I was talking about my aspirations for the center before it even started, it is not important above all else that we at this center solve those problems. We actually want to shout from the rooftops to the world about what we want to solve with these moonshots. And it's entirely possible that someone else will run away with that prize. And that is actually okay. Although I will say it's unlikely, because a lot of the moonshots that we're formulating require the intellectual soil that's here in Denmark, or at least in Scandinavia. Things like preventing the spread of misinformation. It's possible to pursue that in a way here that isn't possible in most other parts of the world. So I think when it comes to bean counting and just looking at things like papers written, textbooks, and so on, we'll have a lot to show. I think we want to cultivate this golden period where you can see that these cohorts of students were passing through and going on to do amazing things, and that they'll feel that they're part of something bigger.
Yeah.
And 20 years from now, there will still be students using those textbooks and using those code bases and saying, oh yeah, that came out of the Pioneer Center. That place was amazing. So much was happening. So we're trying to create that atmosphere.
Yeah.
But the Moonshots, that's where, when I think about why I moved my family, why we're going through all this effort, it's because we want to crack the nut on one or more of those Moonshots. And I'm convinced that we will.
Yeah. I think that's a really good place to wrap it up
Yeah.
today. Thank you for your time, Serge.
Yeah.
And see you soon.
Great. Thanks,
Thank you.
Geet.